Okay, what we will try to do and is mostly expand and demonstrate using maps what has been done in the work described by Professor Audrey. My academic starting point is geography and urban planning, so the issue of segregation is not even a question. We study about it from the first year of our degree, and there's no question whether there is segregation. And the link between education and separatism or segregation or residential segregation is in fact the added value that I found very significant, and the connection and the combination of the various disciplines, as Dr. Shirley Avrami said in one of the last conferences, that once the discipline walls came down, we are able to do much more, to understand much more, and therefore I think that is what I wanted to emphasize: the link between segregation and education, and segregation in general, and where it comes from. So what we see here on the maps is that the population arranges itself within the urban setting according to its characteristics and creates segregation between neighborhoods, but also between neighborhoods, but also between communities and regions. You can't only talk about segregation within a community, within a town or village or city, but also between communities and villages and towns. I mean, people know Tel Aviv, for instance, the metropolitan city of Tel Aviv, which is very big and relatively heterogeneous. But when we go outside it, Ramat Gan, Givatayim are certainly less heterogeneous, and Hod HaSharon and Kfar Savara Anana are even less heterogeneous. So again, there's also an intercity sort of a story here, and when we go to Kochav Yair and other such communities, we will reach levels of segregation that in the metropolitan cities is lower than in the smaller communities. Now, one of the things that were mentioned here several times were that segregation increases. Segregation is on the rise, and that has to do with the first session this morning, where inequality was said to increase. And since segregation is in fact a reflection or an expression of inequality, people want to be more, we want to be closer to those like them, and more distant from those who are not. Then this is in fact an expression of social mobility, and it is expressed in segregation in the environment. When we see inequality increasing, we see segregation increasing, and the dimensions of segregation are the same that are important in inequality. So if people say in the United States, some studies show that that segregation between blacks and whites, so to speak, are on the decline, but there's no change in the components. And so what we see here on the maps, in terms of the ages, there are differences. In terms of the populations, there are differences. You can see that what they said before is true. We see the socioeconomic characterization. If we divide the population within the city into socioeconomic clusters, it's true for Jerusalem, it's true for other places too, then the picture is almost identical to the characterization of segregation according to sectors. So the Arab sector has the lowest socioeconomic characterization, and we see it here, and the ultra-Orthodox sector is very low. Some are 1 to 5 clusters, much like the Arab sector, and then we get to the religious and secular sectors, where you see the link very clearly between sectors, between populations, between socioeconomic characterizations. And of course, this connects to what Audrey said before about the education sectors as well. And here too you can see Bnei Brak, which really speaks to the direction that you showed. And you can see it on the map. It's a relatively homogeneous city, but you can see how the population is divided within it. So what are the main segregation dimensions in Israel? Nationality, religiosity, we see foreign workers compared to Israeli workers, socioeconomic status, and also the composition of ages. Before, a question was raised as to the composition of ages and projections and where we are headed. So there's also segregation in terms of ages. And it's very important to see it also within the city because it shows us the direction of development, the nature of religiosity, what sort of religious, what sort of ultra orthodox. Many times we treat the ultra orthodox as if they are one monolithic group, but we see that within each group there are also segregations within it, different distinctions and variants. In terms of origin, so origin we talked about Asia, Africa, Europe, America, but changes have taken place. The inequality between Asia, Africa compared to Europe and the United States, now between generations inequality has decreased, and now we see less the populations that are distinguished by being from Africa and Asia or from America and Europe. But what we see is the extremism of perhaps the Ethiopian immigrants within the cities. And here again, I'm looking at the screen because it's very small here on my computer screen. But you can see here the distribution of Asia, Africa. And I think this is a nice map. We see on the big screen, the map is as small as you see it on your computer screen, said someone. So what you can see on the maps here is the yeshiva students, and you can see that in some places there are yeshiva students, and in some places there are none. You can see Tel Aviv where there are no yeshiva students. So these entire components of the ultra-Orthodox population, this sector exists. It hardly exists in Tel Aviv, and so the equality components differ. The model of the distribution of the population in the region impacts on heterogeneity in schools. What I'm trying to say here is, and it was also mentioned in previous sessions, that it's not just a matter of segregation, that different populations live in different neighborhoods or in different communities, but also what is the chance, using a relatively small investment, what are the odds of having these populations study together? And the example of Tel Aviv, which is the stronger up north and the weaker in the south, is an example of segregation in large areas. And then the chance that a child is driven from the south, from the north to the south, and will really last, and that's a much smaller chance, and is at least much harder. And therefore the matter of having these children meet one another is far from easy. In Jerusalem, which is much more neighborhood based, even though segregation or the chance of having the weaker population meet the stronger population is much higher. Okay, what we see here is the link between educational achievements, school achievements, and socio-economic segregation. And you don't need to see the details, but the more or the darker the green is, the higher the socioeconomic status is. And in yellow, we see low achievements in matriculation, and in blue, high achievements. And you can really see how in the green areas, you can see that in the areas where the population is of a high socioeconomic status, the matriculation achievements are also higher. And this is a mapping carried out by the Central Bureau of Statistics. It mapped achievements in the matriculation according to the various areas, geographic areas, in their socioeconomic status. What I said before, that the distribution of the population in the metropolitan areas and also the national areas is of a segregative nature, and what we can see here is the socioeconomic characterization, or the distribution of the socioeconomic characterization of the population in the larger cities. And you can see the size of the population as a function. The length of the rectangle is a function of the size of the population. That's why Jerusalem is bigger than Tel Aviv. And the ratio between the various populations according to socioeconomic scale, you can see it within the rectangle. And you can see to what extent Jerusalem is heterogeneous. The population is heterogeneous. Bnei Brak is homogeneous. Tel Aviv has no low socioeconomic status, and this of course has very significant implications on the education system. Now, very briefly, I would like to say that it's not just a matter of how the population is distributed, it's not just a matter of educational segregation and achievements in education. It's also a matter of budgeting by local authorities in various areas, including education. Much work has been carried out by the Center of Democracy by Professor Dahan, and he, along with a co-author, showed the inequality in allocation of funds by local authorities in the education system. It's the same budgets that go beyond the Ministry of Education budgeting. So let's say the Ministry of Education budgets equally. I don't want to go into this so much. There are many ways of looking at it. But the local authorities certainly do not budget equally, and each local authority, according to its own self-income and the number of students and the importance it attributes to education, allocate different sizes of budgets than the Ministry of Education. So what we see here is the cost of education per student in each socioeconomic cluster and the sources of financing, and we can see to what extent the budgeting by the local authorities, those in yellow per student, is the key the wrong way around. Someone is asking whether the key is wrong on the slide. Yes, absolutely right, said the speaker. She just wanted to check that you're all awake. Definitely. I didn't even read the index, and I said the key, excuse me. So we see that the Ministry of Education's allocation per student is quite similar, but there's high variance between the local authorities' budgeting. So the contribution to inequality is not only in terms of the composition of the students or the characterization of the parents of these students, not only in the extent to which parents pay budgets for schools, but there is a large component that comes from budgeting education by the local authority, and the larger the gaps are in income in the local authority, so the differences are seen in the allocation of funds per student in the education system by the local authorities. And in terms of the budget, and to what extent the income of the local authority varies, the composition of the community, of the population, the ages, also has an impact. For instance, in Jerusalem, there's about 200,000 students. It's about the entire city of Rishon, having an entire city of Rishon comprised solely of students. In Tel Aviv, I think there's only 42 or 43,000. So the allocation per student is also a function of the extent to which the local authority can allocate, but also it's a function of how many students there are. Because as we know in education, when you compare Israel to the world, then you say, okay, the percentage of the GDP is quite high, but per students, because there are many children here in Israel, the investment is low. So the same is true also in the local authorities, and you need to pay attention to that. In the social review, or the social poll of the Central Bureau of Statistics, they asked in 2008, what is the main action that the government needs to take in order to close gaps? This is a sample of a population of people over 20, and it's interesting to see that the higher the income, the perception is that investment in education will close the gap. So that's thought-provoking, that's food for thought, and the same is true also for education. I can't go into this because I've run out of time, but this is also interesting if you look at raising taxes for the lower communities, for the lower populations, that's also stronger among the stronger populations. So just to sum up, residential inequality leads to inequality in education. Residential segregation leads to segregation in the education system. The transition from the we generation to the I generation can be seen in the education system. We're not only in transition anymore, we're already there. But when we look back, obviously social views have an impact, significant impact. And I might say that parents don't look for equal opportunity, but rather for utilizing opportunities. So when it comes to equal opportunity, as was discussed in the previous session, and the importance of equal opportunity, a question arises in terms of the parents, whether they would rather have equal opportunity or whether they would like to utilize what they can. Thank you very much.